Is Gareth here? Lost him. Okay. So just come in. This is strange, isn't it? Because I'm not starting and everything's stopped. I'm just waiting for Gareth because he tells me to stop. Just talk amongst yourselves. Just look over that way, casually. Relax. Not. Shall I just start? Yeah. Okay. Gareth's just coming. Okay. When he comes in, give him a round of applause. He'll be really embarrassed.
Slow hand clap.
We'll go with that. Yeah, slow hand clap. That was for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, this is the third, isn't it? I had to go for a stroke then. Okay. This next story is by the lovely Lindsay Meadows, who's just sitting there. Big round of applause. And it's called Landing. How he had held on to the ending, wanted it, longed for it, for his toes on the earth, for his skin warmed with the heat of the sun. He'd never been one for nature, but one day, months ago, he had woken and wanted more than anything to lay down in tall grass and breathe in. And now he was here. He expected it, but still he could hardly function for the shock of crowds of people wanting to interview him, to take their photo with him, grinning, celebrating. He didn't know what exactly. He'd never understood celebrating someone else's achievement. And this was not his achievement. This was the work of men in lab coats. A plan was drawn up, trajectories calculated. He was a monkey in a box. They would have sent a robot in his place if the tech was sophisticated enough, and it had nearly made it. He saw the disappointment in their faces when they told him he'd be going. He wanted to meet the robot who had failed their tests, shake its hand. After the crowds were their family and friends he'd nothing to say to, despite their eager expressions, their hopes for tales of excitement, of planets, ships racing towards the sun. Not endless days in a cramped space you couldn't even call a room, staring at the remote twinkling of stars, panels of switches and controls and screens all in code. They'd known his trip was of significance for its length alone. That did nothing but use machines to scan and sweep and collect data. But here they were, wanting not just him to magic adventure up for them, but to alter himself too, into the sort of person who smiled and told stories with sweeping gestures of his arms. They'd chosen him because he was not that sort of person. And so people tired of him quickly, sank reluctantly back into their dull lives, lives that had for the past 2 decades been more exciting than his. His relatives were slower to disappear, obliged not to be seen to abandon him too quickly, or perhaps hoping he had something for them yet, something in reserve. He met with them a few times, and they stared at him as he did at them, at their faded hair, their wrinkles, the sag of their bones, resenting the reminder of the passage of time, of nearing death. They hadn't done the test yet. They'd contacted him to say that he needed tests. There'd of course been basic monitoring on board, but they couldn't say what the long-term effects were. Couldn't say if tumours would bulge beneath his breastbone, if his limbs would wither, if he would collapse in the street, heart, grey and still. The streets were not the same. He couldn't understand it. He knew technology moved so quickly, but by the time he got back, he would be lost. A time traveller, set adrift. But it still surprised him, even though he'd received some updates, some explanations, brightly coloured broadcasts with exclamation points and shots of systems crashing. He should have paid more attention. He should have imagined how they would translate in his world. But he hadn't cared, because he had his stars and his panels, and when he got back he'd have the ground beneath his feet. Only the ground wasn't the same. He often stopped and stared and tried to work out how it was different. If anyone was with him, they would gently take his arm and move him along like he was a senile old man, mind lost to all his years at sea. He didn't ask about the ground in case it showed that he was. He knew he was not the same man. How could he be? But how could, if he'd known if his mind was as it should be? He often imagined himself here in this world as a man who'd never left, who understood it all. He smiled, he had a wife, children, grandchildren, perhaps. But it wasn't himself he imagined, just a stranger who looked like him. The attention never dried up completely. There were retrospectives, nostalgia-tinted views, patronising interviewers who patted his knee and his shoulder, and sometimes someone would recognise his face and get a thrill and gush at him, and he would nod somberly until they went away. Once there were protesters, angry at the government funds used to sustain him, but they didn't stay long. He lived too modestly. It wasn't satisfying. Later he saw in the news that they'd moved on to another astronaut, one from a smaller mission and one who undoubtedly had been granted nothing like the amount that he had, but displayed his wealth audaciously enough to satisfy the protesters. They shouted and camped outside his door, and then everything was silent, and he didn't know who had retired and left, the protesters or the reporters. And he often dreamed of the stars, of being boxed in. That was how he thought of it then. But now when he jumped to bed, he was comforted. Walls pressed against his back like a hand holding him. He waited until he was dying to give the message. Waited until he had days left at most. His voice, a raspy whisper, caught in his throat. He summoned the media, let them bring in as much equipment as they wanted, arrange him, his wounds to their specifications. Some of them were here hoping that he would die on camera, others to collect material for tributes once he was dead. And maybe one or two were curious to hear what he had to say. Certainly he heard them trying to build up the event to their viewers. What could this old man have to say now after all these years of hiding himself away? Lips closed tight. He knew that when he gave the message, that most, if not all of them, wouldn't believe him. And that was all right. He hadn't promised to convince anyone. He had just promised to give the message. And when he spoke slowly, cleared his throat, took sips of water. He would not be rushed. And he watched the reporters' faces, their eyes, some narrowed with impatience, others wide, worried. He felt some pity for the ones who believed him. It surprised him that he did feel a pang of guilt for the years he'd kept it from them, kept for himself. But he'd needed them, all those years away. Who could blame him, really, for wanting to keep his home as long as he could, even if it had changed, even if he hardly recognised it? When his message finished and the equipment switched off, he leaned back and watched them, rushing, arguing, others leaving silently. Someone approached him to ask questions, but he said that he was done and that they were to leave at once. He said it with as much authority as he could muster, but he was still surprised when they obeyed him. And shortly after, the house was silent. He debated leaving it that way. He'd gone this long already. But eventually he turned on the news, negotiated through the different broadcasts, some sneering, some starkly terrified, but all broadcasting his message. Then there were scientists. They'd been clever things, the aliens. They had understood disbelief. They gave information that was undeniable proof. Only the smallest minorities denied that the message was real after that. And then the riots started. The fires. The world started ending a good 5 months before the ships actually landed. He was struggling to breathe by then, could hardly even process what was happening on the news, the hysteria, the footage of the beings he had for quite some time been quite sure he must have hallucinated. He still wavered on them. He could be hallucinating them now. He turned off the news in the end. He imagined he smelled smoke as he closed his eyes and took one last, shaking breath. Lindsay.